Time. It's one of the greatest commodities.
Welcome to the Living Superfood Show. My name is Umoya, and I'm here with my co-host, the one and only Master Chef, Health and Food Scientist, Kidi Awadu. How you doing today, sir?
We black and we shine, my brother Umoya. I hope you are in that fantastic spirits again today.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. All right, so today we're going to be actually talking about COVID-19, and if you can give up some updates on that, we would greatly appreciate it. So the first question is, supposedly COVID-19 originated in Wuhan, China. Is this true?
We don't know if it's true. I began investigating this on February 3rd, I believe it was the first day I started writing my reports on this. I, of course, had been looking at some of it, but in the first weeks or so, I was just rather dismissing it as, here we go again. The World Health Organizations and other epidemiological agencies freaking out the public once more. We remember HIV. We remember swine flu. We remember H1N1. We remember avian flu, SARS, Zika. It goes on and on. But at a certain point, this thing took off on a momentum of its own that we haven't seen since the early mid-1980s, when HIV/AIDS and some of the characters in the current story rushed to the podium to tell us we had a catastrophe on our hands. So did it originate in Wuhan, China? According to many sources, that was where the official patient zero, which is they call the beginning of this pandemic or case, or an epidemical case. They always talk about who's the first patient zero. It's said to have originated from cross-species transmission in a Chinese wet market where exotic animals are butchered for people. But there are a lot of question marks, serious question marks around that. There has recently been the exposure in the U.S. press that the mayor of Bellevue, New Jersey, his name is Michael Melham, actually came down with a serious case of pneumonia a month before the Wuhan case, from which he was hit pretty hard, but he recovered from it, and later tested positive, according to these antibody tests, tested positive for having IgG antibodies to the coronavirus 19, COVID-19. Well, that would make him the earliest reported case. He said he had not gotten sick since then, and he would definitely notice himself, reverting back into some sort of either upper respiratory or lower respiratory. And so we don't know, did it originate in Wuhan, China, or did it originate in Belleville, New Jersey? Hey, flip a coin. Whichever wins, heads or tails, let's make that the official story.
Okay. I saw a report on ABC News that the COVID-19 is mutating. Now, there is supposedly a European strain. Is this valid or just propaganda? And is there any science behind or science-based information to confirm this mutation?
As you and I talked about off the air, I have a fundamental problem with the whole science of virology. And if one is to accept virology as a science, then you have to deal with the fact that no viruses are exactly the same. Mutation is said to be the norm in these type of elements, and that brings really a whole spectrum of questions to the forefront. What is a virus? Is a virus an attacker to the body, or does the body create viruses itself? So if we are to accept what the virologists say, then mutations of virus is not only common, it might be that every virus presented is a mutation, and that opened up a whole new bucket of worms.
So does covering the face help stop the spread of COVID-19?
It helps to spread COVID-19 panic and hysteria. But the idea of using a barrier, such a cloth barrier, to prevent the transmission of something that might be 1/5,000,000th the size of a cell is ludicrous. It's absurd. And I've seen no credible research papers, no science papers, only news stories, but I've seen no science papers that have ever said that wearing a face mask, a cloth face mask, especially the ones that are being sold, would in any way prevent the transmission of a virus. And we have to remember, viruses don't just enter the body through the mouth or through the nose. Viruses enter the body through a whole spectrum of different sources. And we have to always keep in mind also, viruses are ubiquitous. So I have several papers in my collection that confirm that on any given day, per square meter of the Earth's surface, some 25,000 viruses fall out of the atmosphere, landing on every square meter of every day of the surface of the Earth. So viruses are ubiquitous. So preventing virus infection or a virus exposure through face mask is a ridiculous idea. But, also buying massive amounts of toilet paper in response to a global epidemic of infectious disease is pretty ludicrous as well. So we've seen some ludicrous acts going down in this case.
So what about gloves? Do gloves help stop the spread of COVID-19?
No. What gloves can do at best is protect you from being exposed to mucus, which someone might have expressed. Mucus is ubiquitous again in the human body. Mucus is the formation of immunoglobulin. In this case, it would be, I guess, immunoglobulin B or M, which is active agent in fighting pathogens. Our bodies are in a constant state of inflammation. And being in a constant state of inflammation, the human body is going to produce probably a quart of mucus per day. And this mucus comes out of the body in numerous ways, and it does find itself in all aspects of the atmosphere. People spit on the sidewalk, and if what they say about viruses living, quote unquote, living outside the body for up to a week on any given surface, who's to say that every time somebody spits in anywhere they spit, there could be implanting dozens, hundreds, millions, or 5 or tens of millions of viruses and hacking up some mucus.
All right. So who is Dr. Anthony Fauci, and why should the public listen or not listen to him? And why was he appointed to the COVID-19 task force?
Dr. Anthony Fauci, he is the head of the Health and Human Services agency called the United States Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases. And so in such a position, one would naturally go to a person like Dr. Anthony Fauci for information regarding the nation's response to infectious diseases. One of my biggest problems with Anthony Fauci is that Anthony Fauci has been around for a long, long time. For 34, 36 years now, the world has been in the grips of another pandemic. In this case, we're talking about HIV/AIDS. An interesting article appeared in January in the New York Times where they were looking at this new phenomena. At that time, it was emerging from the gay recreational sex community, as well as intravenous drug users and hemophiliac blood product users were said to be those communities most likely at the center of the newly discovered or this newly identified pandemic. And then on April 23rd of that year, there was the announcement by Margaret Heckler and Robert Gallo that they had found a causative agent for this new phenomena called HIV/AIDS. Or it wasn't even called HIV at that point. In fact, it was being called gay-related immunodeficiency GRID. But interesting, but when this article in the New York Times, an opinion piece, comes out, at the beginning of the piece, a number of researchers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were being asked about the threat of HIV diversifying into the heterosexual community. And the headline of the article and some of their responses were, this is perhaps being overblown and an hysteria is being created. But in the same article, the writers of the article then went to ask Anthony Fauci, who had just been appointed the head of the United States Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, USIAID. And when asked about this, Anthony Fauci makes some very provocative statements, essentially saying, we don't know where this will go, that HIV could very well likely break out into the heterosexual community in America, and within the next 5 to 10 years, this is again said in 1986, so his predictions go from 1991 to 1996. He said there could be tens of millions of deaths in America from heterosexual HIV, 100 million deaths or more across Africa, and either him or Harry Haverskos, who was his running buddy, said that this would virtually wipe out the childbearing age population of Haiti by 1996. Well, guess what? All three of those predictions came up woefully wrong. So if Anthony Fauci was so wrong at that time, why is he being put in charge of the White House task force and the number one point person in the country on this at this time? Some might suspect that they want us all to be scared and panicky, and Anthony Fauci is just the go-to guy for that.
Okay. Well, you reside in Nevada, so I actually have a Nevada question for you. So it looks like Nevada is starting to officially open up more of its businesses in quote-unquote phase one. So are people in public still wearing masks and gloves? And what do you think about social distancing, and what will the casinos look like when the casinos actually open?
As I've been going out on nearly a daily basis in the last week or so, I stopped any pretense. I knew it was all kind of phony, but I was saying, well, since everybody else is so freaked out, I'm more afraid of their hysteria and panic than I am about any mysterious a COVID element. So I would, kind of go undercover as a scared person. And then I said, oh, this is a bunch of nonsense. It's inconvenient. And I stopped doing that. And I noticed a whole bunch of people stopped. So on any given day, I think yesterday I said, well, let me see how many people are and how many people are not gloving up and masking up. And I think by yesterday's determination, it was about 50-50. And the people who aren't masked and aren't gloved, they're not freaking out everybody else. So I would say probably about half of the people now are ready to just put this thing aside. And especially as we come to understand that the comorbidity profile, these diseases that are said to be affecting the people dying of this is mainly affecting elderly people with weakened systems, people with already existing life-threatening conditions such as cancer, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure. Even a 5-year-old girl dies of meningital encephalitis, and they want to call it a COVID death, even though quite likely her death was more related to the drug-induced coma that they put her on in order to keep her on a respirator. So I think that the people are ready to just move beyond all of this. And when we're talking about a place like Las Vegas, where the casinos and the tourism culture is so economically important to this city, unless and until they allow the people to freely mingle and mix and do what they do, this city is going to be devastated the longer that this social isolation continues.
So some people who came down with the COVID-19 symptoms are now taking, I guess, what they call antibody tests to confirm if they had been infected by COVID-19. So what is an antibody test, and is antibody testing reliable to detect the COVID or the coronavirus?
I have been writing quite extensively about the failure of COVID antibody testing. And I think, I know this, that if there is no valid test for a infectious agent, then you cannot ever say that anyone for sure is infected. And we do know now that these test manufacturers, they have to publish the data on the specifics of their tests. How sensitive is it? How specific is it? How accurate is it? How useful is it for positive predictive value? What percentage of false positives or false negatives should be expected? And I'm going to be doing much more work on this coming Friday. Have been doing a lot, and I have 12 references specific about the test. Nearly every one of them confesses that these tests are highly invalid. So I continue to ask anybody who out there who wants to disagree with me to please forward to me any information that they could on whether there was a valid test for COVID-19 that has been confirmed using the gold standards method of confirming the presence of an infectious agent. Now, I have been reading these test kits, and I've got some of the test kits for COVID-19, and I tell people just read it and read it for the details. And, there's 2 or 3 lines in there will tell you this is not an absolute test for this. And so some of these tests are talking about a thing called a positive predictive value, which ultimately becomes the ultimate usage of this test. So I say this much. When we see positive predictive values as low as 55% or as high as 55% on a test or as low as 37% on a test, well, I would say if I were head of a classroom administering tests to my students, if a student brought back a test with a 55 score or a 37% score on the test, I would consider that to be a failing grade.
Okay. So Keedy, just to clarify, because I think my audience, including myself, just really want to know, what do they mean by antibody? Like what information are they trying to get when they say antibody testing?
Well, you're making an excellent point, because there is no direct test for COVID-19. Now, they may say, well, we have these reverse transcriptase PCR testing, but even the inventor of that test, Dr. Kary Mullis, when they were claiming to use that test for HIV, he was one of the loudest critics. He said, you're misusing the technology that I invented. And I'm trying to tell you, this is not what you're claiming it to be. So they do not test for COVID-19. What they claim to be testing for is exposure to COVID-19 through the creation of antibodies. Now, there are 3 types of antibodies they claim to be looking for, and no single test looks for all 3 types. The 3 types are IgA, meaning immunoglobulin A, and IgA are the first sets of antibodies or antigens or antibodies to appear when the infection begins. Initially, it's basically the sentinel saying, hey, we've got a problem over here. We find these invaders. Then when the invaders are to be fought, that's your IgM, which is now your body's in the active phase of fighting against some sort of pathogenic infectious agent. And then once the agent is done with and your body has suppressed it, then it creates IgG antibodies, which are the long-term sentinels waiting to see if this ever comes back. So in the case of COVID, in most of the cases, they're looking for IgM and or IgG antibodies. But there's a lot of problems with that. For one, they're doing this by looking for protein gradients and protein weights insofar as these immunosorbent assays. And that is flawed because, if you have no gold standard confirming the pathogen in the first place, how do you know which proteins produce which molecular weights that are exclusive only to that pathogen? I mean, it's just a really tremendously flawed set of steps that go into these tests. There are so many problems with these antibody assays that I say, and I'm not the first to say this, there are many others who say this about antibody testing for pathogens. If they can't find the germ, you don't have it. If they can only find antibodies that say you were exposed to it and now you're cured from it, well, that's the same philosophy that they want to use to promote vaccinations. You won't have the pathogen, you'll just have the antibodies, you're protected. Now they say you just have the antibodies and it's making you sick. That is absolutely contradictory logic.
Wow. Yeah, hopefully this information goes viral. No pun intended. Um,
That's the only kind of virology that should be allowed to tolerate internet and people to people communication of vital, usable information.
right. All right, so we got a couple more questions here to go through. This is definitely a good build. So, according to a New York Times article, 1/3 of all U.S. coronavirus deaths are nursing home residents or workers. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, now this comes down to this question of comorbidities. And this is probably as important to understanding why this thing falls apart as anything else we could understand. According to the first research that I was doing on this, we saw the first comorbidities associated with the deaths from coronavirus all seem to be pneumonia. And for the first 2 to 3 weeks, I talked about coronavirus only as, well, these are just normal background pneumonia deaths. And for the first month, it seemed like the coronavirus deaths only numbered about 0.8 or 0.83 to 0.89% of already existing pneumonia deaths, wherever they could be identified. But suddenly the numbers of COVID deaths started escalating exponentially. And it wasn't until the Italy, which was at that time outside of China, beyond China, after China, now Italy was the epicenter of COVID in the world. And I hope you can remember that particular point. But a week or two into it, a group of Italian scientists decided to look at the death certificates of those people who were dying of COVID and see if they could see any type of a profile there, and they found it. And it was that the majority of people dying from coronavirus deaths in Italy had 3 or 2 comorbidities, meaning they were already sick of serious chronic diseases. The most common ones were diabetes, hypertension or high blood pressure, but they also included cardiovascular disease in that. And they noticed in the Italian study that the average age of coronavirus deaths was 79.5 years of age. Well, now, that was when it opened up to me, oh, now that's why the numbers are growing so fast. It's not just pneumonia or lower respiratory disease, chronic or acute lower respiratory disease. Now they're including all these others. So I have put together a list now, and this number of coronavirus deaths is up to 15. They tried to put a 16th one in, saying that now it's a sexually transmitted disease.
Oh,
but
wow.
I think they just backed off of that, and they said, this is so ridiculous, let's just leave that one alone. But here they are. Here are the 15 coronavirus-associated deaths. Comorbidity is what it's called. And as you're listening to this list, I want people to consider that if coronavirus had never come around, with these 15 different causes of death added together for whatever reason you could tie them together, would this be the number one cause of death? They include, number 1, acute upper respiratory syndrome, colds and flu. Number 2, acute lower respiratory disease, pneumonia. Number 3, chronic lung diseases, and that's commonly known as COPD. Number 4, hypertension. 5, diabetes. 6, cardiovascular disease. 7, kidney disease. 8, chronic dehydration. 9, cancer. 10, metabolic syndrome. 11, advanced age with accompanying geriatric features. Number 12, encephalitis, meningitis, and necrotizing encephalitis. Number 13, autoimmune disorder, lupus and sarcoidosis. Number 14, blood clots. And number 15 now, pediatric multi-system inflammatory syndrome, also known as Kawasaki disease shock syndrome. And that's a complicated way of saying childhood AIDS.
Wow. So, according to an NPR report, a host, I believe you pronounce her name, Elsa Chang, stated the highest number of COVID-19 cases tied to one location in the U.S. is a state prison in central Ohio. 80% of inmates there have tested positive for the virus. So my question is, if prison populations are supposed to be highly secured, it would seem to me that prisons would be the best protocol to halt infectious diseases like the coronavirus. What are your thoughts on that?
On one hand, that seems like a logical thought, that since there is so little exposure to the outside world, you would think that the prisoners would be relatively safe. I mean, they're in cages by themselves. It's not like they're exchanging high amounts of one-on-one contact with each other. But on the other hand, it's like, how do they know that anyone is infected? Well, let's test them. Well, what do we test them with? Let's test them with the one of at least 90 different COVID antibody tests that are now being circulated through the United States. Now, the United States Food and Drug Administration has given emergency use authorization, EUA authorization, to, I believe, about 4 of these, of which one of the 4 that they gave emergency use authorization to was made by Abbott Laboratories, who pulled theirs off the shelf, or they pulled theirs out of circulation within a month because they were getting such bad reports about false negatives and false positives. The test had very low performance and positive predictive value. So over 90 of these antibody tests are out there. Where do these come from? Where, if it's said that our body doesn't create IgG antibodies until as much as 90 days after an infection, then where did the testing for the early cases come from? It appears that they were using old tests left over from the era of SARS coronavirus, and that was well over a decade ago. So I don't have any idea, and I don't think anyone could produce any idea of the validation of the testing of these people in this state prison facility in Central Ohio. If we were to look closely at the protocol for testing there, I bet you we'd find some very serious flaws and breaches of the very testing protocol that is listed on the package insert, which comes with all of these test kits. I have copies of these package test inserts, and they have some shocking things on it that the manufacturers don't necessarily want the public to focus on.
Okay. So we're almost about to wrap it up here. So I have one last question for you. So states are trying to catch up with testing for coronavirus as well as having a reliable vaccine. Do you think state agencies are being genuine in their approach to fighting COVID-19, or do you see a hidden hand with Big Pharma behind the scenes?
Oh, there is no doubt that the medical, pharmaceutical, healthcare cartel is what I call them, that have already strained this country to the point of before this comes along, they're already grabbing 17.9% of gross domestic product, far, far, far and above what any other nation spends on health care. $4 trillion a year for U.S. people of a U.S. population. And this is not a healthy population compared to other OECD nations, the list of the world's 35 most wealthy nations. And so have they been opportunists in this? Beyond a shadow of a doubt. They are now fast-tracking their profit-making substances. They're pulling old, unuseful drugs off the shelf that have failed in other instances, like remdesivir, and now they're pulling it out and saying, oh, we have some promising hope that 6 people who took remdesivir recovered 2 days faster from coronavirus than they would have had they not been taking a placebo. Well, the people taking the placebo, they got better too, but it took them 2 days longer. That seems to be what they're saying. And we do know that remdesivir, like all of the other antivirals that they have on their shelves, remdesivir has the same set of extremely toxic side effects. In the new book I'm writing, I'm listing these particular antiviral drugs that are being rushed out here to be used for this, including the hydrochloroquine, the malaria drug, which itself has some pretty serious side effects as well. So are they capitalizing, cashing in? Yes. Can they be trusted to put out an effective and safe vaccine using the fast tracking protocol that they are doing? No. And there are international laws that forbid people to be forced into human experimentation. All vaccines, because they keep changing the formulas, changing the protocols, all vaccines come under the category of human experimentation. And so I know, I for one, and anybody who wants to ask me on how they can better do so, I will give them advice. I will not, never, ever, ever, ever be injected with a rush to the market coronavirus vaccine or any other vaccine, whether it's rushed to the market or not. No, this is absurd. It's some of the worst science we could ever imagine. But the thing is they could never get away with this unless they first put the public in a heightened state of fear, panic, and hysteria to the point that they are clamoring for any type of solution. Didn't we go through all this once before in the mid-1980s with the outcry from the homosexual community? We need drugs for AIDS. They got what they asked for. They got the toxic poison AZT, which killed everybody who was on it within 3 years of administration, of getting on the AZT formula. Everybody who was on it died.
Wow. Well, Keedy, I think our time is pretty much up. So I definitely want to thank you for your time, and as always, appreciate you. Is there anything else you want to mention? Your website? You mentioned your book. Do you want to mention something else before we wrap it up?
Well, I would love it if people were pre-ordering the book. I'm writing it right now. I was hoping to have it done in about 10 days, and then I realized, oh, man, I can't do that because it's a book on science. And when you're writing about science, there's so much cross-checking, referencing, and validation. You got to get it right because that's the scientific method. Scientific method doesn't like subjectivity. It likes objectivity. Give me the hard facts. Give it to me in black and white. I don't want a bunch of gray area. The book is going to be, it's being pre-sold at thepanicbook.com. This will be my 36th book publication and the second book of the year. I'm very excited, not just about what we're revealing in the book, but now what's got me excited is this is a major, big game changer in the world, a paradigm shift, and we know that, and we see it in context. So we need to be thinking, acting, and doing and investing right now in what is our world that we're in control of going to be looking like on the other side of COVID. And so that's where our focus is on right now. What are we going to do now that lasts as long-term return on investment when this thing blows away? And it will be blowing away, but things will never be the same again.
All right, and can they check you also out at livingsuperfood.com as well?
Livingsuperfood.com, where we always say food is nature's most perfect medicine, and we got some dynamite recipes containing the most perfect medicine one could ever have to live free of disease. We like to say, don't get sick, stay off drugs, and live a long time. Thank you, Brother Moria, for all your commitment to making sure that the people get the information they need to protect themselves and their family.
Thank you, Keedy, and thank you, everyone, for your time. This is the Living Superfood Show, and until next time, take care.